You're gonna need a bigger potion. Why so serious?
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Oh, welcome to this podcast review for December 5th, 2023, and I'm Janie Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy.
Hey, thanks for joining us, everybody, for this conversation. It seems like it is the theme of the season in that we are going to be talking about a movie that everybody loves. Absolutely no polarization whatsoever.
Are you setting us up for failure right now, JD? Is that what you're doing?
I will say, though, like, when this film dropped on Netflix last week, I almost felt like the conversation was more heated than Saltburn.
Oh, yeah.
Arguably.
Well, maybe among certain circles, especially given the subject matter of this film.
I get.
We'll talk about. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm not saying it's unwarranted. I understand the debate, but my goodness, it was electrifying.
It was pretty aggressive.
It was very aggressive.
Yeah, people have opinions. Well,
They
to
do
say
have
it
their opinions.
as politically correctly as possible. I'll just leave it at that.
Absolutely, but that is to say, we're here to talk about the great Todd Haynes, his latest film, May December.
Love Todd.
That dropped on Netflix last Friday. I always look forward to a Todd Haynes film.
None of them are alike, yet you can kind of tell it's a Todd Haynes film. He's got certain, I guess, movements that he likes to latch on to, whether it be the music side of him with movies like I'm Not There and Velvet Goldmine, and even the documentary The Velvet Underground. He's also got the promiscuous side to him, portraying certain taboo situations that challenge our perceptions, especially within our current social climate. Movies like Far From Heaven, which is so Douglas Sirk, it's honestly crazy. And then Carol, kind of an extension of that in many ways. And then he sometimes does some weird experimental thrillers like Safe. And his first film, Poison, I think sort of fits in that camp as well, but I haven't seen it. That's just what I've heard. And then he does a kids movie like Wonderstruck, which I think is one of his better movies.
I like it a lot as well.
Yeah,
absolutely. I'm a big Todd Haynes guy. I absolutely want to talk about that in the context of May December when we get into this conversation here.
Sure.
But yeah, he's a fascinating filmmaker that has some absolute bangers on his resume. And we'll see where May December falls into all of that.
Yeah.
I also wanted to ask you because, as we've just denoted, we're big fans of Todd Haynes. He's made our top 10 list over the years. I don't recall, was this film in your top 10 most anticipated at the beginning of the year?
Good question. I don't
remember?
I'd have to go back and look at that list that we published earlier in the year. At the very least, it was top of mind. I may have had it top 20 or something like that if we actually did that full list of a 20.
Yeah.
But it was. I think the thing was, if I didn't have it in my top 10 most anticipated of the year, it's probably because I just didn't know enough about it.
We didn't know enough. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think in the beginning of the year, we knew this film was potentially coming and who was in it, but that was more or less the extent of it. We didn't even really know the subject matter that much. It was pretty vague at that point.
Absolutely. I don't know off the top of my head. I'd have to go and look it up. I did not have time to do that before this conversation. I don't think it was in my top 10 most anticipated, if I had to guess.
Yeah.
But to your point, definitely on the periphery.
Oh, for sure.
Something we're very much looking forward to, for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, with that said, are you ready to just jump right on in here?
Let's do this. This will be fun.
Okay. This is going to be incredibly fascinating. So this film, May December, it is directed by Todd Haynes, written by Sammy Birch. And if I read correctly, I could be misremembering here, but I think I read this was her first screenplay.
That's what I think I saw. And if I'm pulling up her IMDb profile right now to confirm this, but from what I've seen, this is her first first written material, she is mostly known for being a casting director of all things.
Wow.
And it looks like Sammy has worked on films as a casting director that I've admittedly not really heard of, so kind of below the stratosphere that we tend to focus on, I guess, sadly speaking. But yeah, this is a break. This is what we call like a breakthrough performance, right?
Yes.
Just it's not an acting performance. We have an award for this at the Inception Film
That's
Awards,
what I was
right,
going to
JD?
bring up.
Yeah.
Yep. That's what I was going to bring up. I don't want to get ahead of myself necessarily since we haven't gotten into the review yet.
I think we played our cards a little bit already with how we feel about this movie.
We have an award at the Inception Film Awards that highlight these breakthrough performers, and not just actors and actresses, directors, screenwriters, composers.
Yeah.
We like to highlight those.
It's basically like our version of Best New Artist from the Grammys.
Yes. Yeah, more or less that's
exactly.
what it is. And perhaps Sammy Birch will be represented. Who knows? We'll see.
We'll see.
All right. This film stars Natalie Portman, Julianne Moore, and Charles Melton, among others.
Mm-hmm.
If you're not familiar with May December, 20 years after their notorious tabloid romance that gripped the nation, a married couple buckles under pressure when an actress arrives to do research for a film about their past.
I love the way you do these synopses now. I think I'm going to say it every single time we do a review. I'm just going to acknowledge your joy and your animation when doing that.
Look, having fun,
Although,
setting up the conversations here.
I think this is a film that maybe warrants that type of animation.
Yeah.
So
It's okay to be a little heightened, I guess. When it comes to this conversation.
Yeah.
So what did you think about May December?
Well, this movie rocks. This movie rocks, dude. I can't lead up to it because I feel like we already played our cards accidentally leading up to the intro of our thoughts here. I think this movie is it's complex, it's bold, it's cruel, it's tragic, it's meta, it's thrilling, it's hilarious. This is a movie. This is a movie. It's all of those things. And it really does get you thinking. You mentioned Todd Haynes there. We talked about a few of his films and how he's such an interesting filmmaker. And even when he does some of his smaller films like Dark Waters, for instance, right? Even then, like it still weirdly feels Todd Haynes-ish, right? It doesn't feel like a director for hire job, even if it could have been in any other director's hands, right?
Sure.
Everything he does feels like it has a purpose within his filmography, and this one does as well, especially when you compare it to movies like Far From Heaven and Carol that sort of challenge how we perceive relationships within our culture and our day and age. And this one does it in a way it's complex in a way that's both kind of saddening but also kind of icky. and the film does address that. We'll talk more about that as far as what it means thematically for certain characters, especially how each of these three leads here. It really is a three-person show in many ways. This is definitely a triangle happening here, and they all have their own individual stories to tell. That almost feel like they could be a movie in and of themselves. They are each the lead of their own respective thematic stories, and somehow they all coalesce in a way that's weirdly well balanced, especially tonally, because this movie is darkly funny at times.
Yes.
I've seen people use the word camp a lot, which I don't want to use because I feel like that word has lost a little bit of meaning as the years have gone on, but the film does take itself seriously while also not taking itself seriously. And I think that balance is a really tricky thing that the film does a very good job. And Todd Haynes, especially as a director, does a very good job maneuvering these performances, do a great job maneuvering that as well. Really does a great job asking the question, what it means to portray and understand characters who don't deserve our sympathy, which we'll talk about a little bit further. The fact that the poster of this movie is, or at least one of the posters, is sort of like a Rorschach test. That's kind of the underlying basis of the movie. It's sort of a Rorschach test for what the unreliable narrator is. And I think that is really compelling.
Sure.
Before I toss it back to you, did you know that this was actually loosely based on a
I
true
did.
story.
I did know that. Yes.
Okay, yeah, because there was an interview going pretty viral on Twitter a couple days ago. This being a woman named Mary Kay
Yeah.
Letourneau.
I haven't heard her thoughts on it though.
I haven't heard her thoughts on the movie, but there's an interview from maybe it was in the 90s, maybe the 2000s,
Okay.
between her and the young subject of their romance.
Gotcha.
And the way she pushes back, there is so much of Julianne Moore's performance in it. It's honestly kind of scary.
That's incredible. I did not see that.
Yeah, I recommend you check that out, especially if you've seen this movie. And for
Wow.
those for everyone listening and watching, if you haven't seen that interview, there's a battle of wits that occurs at the end of this specific segment of the interview that is honestly kind of frightening how in line it is with Julianne Moore's Gracie in this movie.
Wow.
But yeah, I think this movie's great. I think it's one of the best movies of the year.
Wow. Okay. Yes. As we noted earlier, this film has been polarizing. I will acknowledge why. I do understand the argument, but I'm wholly with you, Brendan. I loved this movie. I think it's one of the best films of the year. In so many ways, it's the quintessential Todd Haynes film. He expertly weaves melodrama like nobody else, and he loves examining the facade of suburban life. The idea that a picture-perfect home is actually the American dream turned into a nightmare is at the core of a lot of his movies. And this film sees Haynes not only going back to his roots in that regard, but this is the hottest gas he's ever cooked with. And it doesn't take long for us to realize that Haynes isn't messing around, right? It's been passed around on social media, but in that first scene, at least once we get to the house, we see the family having a little cookout. The kids are running around. And at first, everything seems mostly normal. But after Gracie has a brief exchange with Joe, she turns and walks toward the fridge and opens the door. As she does this, instantly, as she grabs the handle, Marcelo Zarvis's impeccably melodramatic score hits, and we hear her say, "I don't think we have enough hot dogs," to which Haynes cuts to an overhead shot of a grill with like 20 hot dogs on it. I mean, talk about a tone setter.
That is going to be the cut of the year.
It's so good.
The edit of the year.
It's so good. It's remarkable filmmaking that's as brazen as it is elegant. And once Elizabeth arrives, there's a queasy, uneasy tension that is constantly simmering. There's a sparring between the two that isn't out in the open until the end. But my goodness, is it engrossing to see how it unfolds. And then there's Joe, who will go down as one of the most heartbreaking characters of the year.
Yeah.
We'll certainly talk about it more as we go here, but there are a few moments that absolutely wrecked me. If Charles Mann isn't nominated for an Oscar, I'm going to riot. He is all of the hype and more. He's going toe-to-toe with two of the greats working today, and he easily keeps pace with the both of them, which is impressive on its own, but maybe more so when you consider that Portman is really stunning in this film. It's one of her best performances, and she might even be nominated for Best Actress.
Yeah.
He's so incredible here. Todd Haynes, God love him, doing his best Alexander Payne impression. I don't think he makes bad movies. I've really liked everything he's done.
Sure,
But like Payne in The Holdovers, there's something about him, speaking of Todd Haynes, him in this film going back to his roots where he just thrives, that I am absolutely enthralled by. And man, this film is all the better for it. It's fantastic.
You mentioned the hot dog moment, which is going to be memeified. It's going to be referenced quite often as we get to the year's best films and some of the year's best scenes and moments.
Yeah.
But it is emblematic of the film as a whole. It's a joke that really has no punchline or meaning. It's really just more of how it sets tone. That's just really awkward and weird
it's a tone
and funny.
setter. Yeah.
That's what it is. And it proves how like perceptively melodramatic this film is going to be while still tackling some very serious subjects that were meant to really ponder on. And the film doesn't give us any easy answers, which is something I really appreciate about the film's use of melodrama, because many times melodramatic films are very they play their cards very close to their chests. They're pretty on the nose at times, and this one isn't. The way that our allegiances change for certain characters is it's subtle. It sometimes happens within seconds of each other. It's very complex in that way. But the film is the way it plays with music to set tone, it is kind of silly. The music here by, I know, what's his name? It's I'm scrolling through. Marcelo Zarvas is the credited composer here, but a lot of the music here is an adaptation of Michel Legrand, the French composer. He's mostly known for films like The Umbrellas of Cherbourg, for instance, right? And that music, especially within an operatic musical like setting, it can seem very melodramatic if it's not applied to that specific setting, right? So you take that
the go-between, right? Specifically,
the go-between as well. That's where it was extracted from. But Legrand and some of his music and other musicals. If you take the almost overbearing nature of those scores and you place it in a domestic drama like this, it's going to sound weird. and I love the way it's utilized here, and you counteract that with a performance by Charles Melton here, which I'm with you. It's like I said, each of these three characters have their own thematic arcs that could have felt so disconnected from each other, and yet they all have a place, and the interweaving of all that is great. I do think Charles Melton is fantastic here. He is the emotional center of this movie, and the irony that he's playing a 36-year-old now. He's a really good-looking guy, but there are many times watching him on screen and watching his dynamic with Julianne Moore where honestly I couldn't really tell if they were a married couple or a mother and son. Right? It's
the casting is incredible.
But it's their respective performances and the kind of agency that Gracie, Julianne Moore's character, has, that it's almost it's so demanding in a motherly kind of way that you find yourself confusing their dynamic, and the movie is trying to do that. Like, it's trying to cloud that a little bit and make it even more icky because of that. So it's a really interesting battle going on there, and Charles Melton is so good at kind of playing the timid teenager that never really got a chance to grow up, sadly.
Absolutely. And you're right. What you're speaking to in terms of how Todd Haynes is playing with form here in convention, it's really compelling, and it certainly ties itself well to the dynamic of these three characters, the performance that's bolstering them for sure, but the dynamic between them and perhaps what we're expecting from them. That's where Todd Haynes, I think, gets to have his cake and eat it too.
For sure.
I do want to talk about Joe here in a moment, but I want to spin off here quickly to talk about Gracie and Elizabeth and how Todd Haynes sets that specific dynamic up, because I think most of what we see funnels from there. And it is really engrossing, those two characters here and what's at play between them. I do think it's clear from the moment they meet that Gracie has no interest in Elizabeth. I love that even though she's expecting Elizabeth, this actress who is going to portray Gracie in a movie.
Oh, yeah. There's tension there. Yeah.
Elizabeth played by Portman, Gracie, Julianne Moore, just to bring some clarity to that in case you haven't seen the film. And so even though she's expecting Elizabeth to show up at her house, she isn't waiting by the door or pandering to her in any way. Elizabeth, once she gets to the house, she has to walk around the house to the backyard to meet everybody.
Yeah.
It's a small detail, but it shows that Elizabeth is not Gracie's priority. And also, you got to love the package that's sitting there on their doorstep. I was just
going to say, she arrives and delivers a package because it was on their doorstep. And what is in that package? Probably the same thing that Gracie sees in Elizabeth at that moment.
It is a blunt metaphor for sure. But that's what makes Todd Haynes so captivating to me as an artist. He's not afraid to be unvarnished. He wants to explore the rough edges of society and relationships, especially especially the polarity of reality and what is versus the facade of appearances and what's supposed to be. That's at the heart of Carol and Far From
Yeah.
Heaven. It's
Yeah.
definitely a part of Safe as well, although in a more allegorical way in that film.
Sure.
And while not exactly the same, Wonderstruck and I'm Not There feature their own paradoxes that complement Haynes' fundamental ethos as a filmmaker. And I love that about his movies because there often is a vast difference between reality and the mechanics that govern our social lives. We all want some sort of domestic peace and relational bliss, but often reality is complicated. It's full of moral and political conflict, sometimes existential conflict. And my God, does this film feature all of that and more, especially when you consider Elizabeth's role here and how she exemplifies how art can amplify those variances, which is a fascinating new dimension to the way Haynes has explored these dualities. Because Elizabeth isn't concerned with Gracie's well-being. All she wants to find is some sort of dramatic truth and is willing to completely submit herself morally to get it, which, of course, renders her motives awfully murky.
Yeah.
She may not be as manipulative as Gracie, but her actions here are, we'll say, questionable. And
They're
I
selfish.
love,
She has a job to do, but they are very selfish. They are disregarding someone else's feelings in the process.
and I love how Haynes adds that dynamic to
Yeah.
his formula. It certainly makes for some blistering moments in this film, especially between those two characters.
I do think Natalie Portman gives one of her best performances in this movie. It might be her most challenging work because of that gradual shift that you're talking about. As someone who is an artist that has a job to do and is willing to disregard the subject's feelings in order to convey some type of truth in that. And it's pretty ironic because she constantly says, Elizabeth specifically, that she wants to find some emotional truth in Gracie to portray it right. Okay.
Yes.
At the same, and on one hand, that sounds like she wants to respect Gracie and treat her like a person. But then at the same time, in doing so, she's also not really doing that.
Yeah.
So there is sort of a breach happening there. And as the film progresses and we start to really understand Elizabeth's kind of, I guess, narcissism in some ways, and how that. Well, I was trying to find the right word for it, and I think narcissism is a pretty. Like it even sounds aggressive. It's a very aggressive word, but it is an appropriate word here because I was about to describe Gracie as very narcissistic as well. And when we start to recognize those attributes in both of them, it's there I was really reminded of Ingmar Bergman's Persona and the literal morphing of these two characters. You even kind of notice
Great
similar.
point, actually.
And I can't take credit for that. I think I've seen a few other people make that comparison to Persona, and I do think it's a very apt comparison. Because you start to notice as the film goes on that there are visual parallels between the two. They slowly start to dress alike a little bit.
Oh my gosh, yes.
One of the key defining traits of Gracie, or at least I guess characteristics, not really a trait, it's her lisp. She has this very defined lisp that isn't really ever explained. And then there are a few moments where I thought Elizabeth was slowly adopting that lisp. And I couldn't tell if I was just hearing it in my head or not. Like the way Todd Haynes plays with expectations is so provocative and interesting here, and these performances do it so well.
Well, what you're describing is what's ravishing about the Elizabeth character in many regards, and also what makes her so goddamn insane. She is one of the most, I don't even know how to describe it, complicated characters we've seen all year. And again, it's amazing how art, in this case performance, somehow takes a situation that is already murky and makes it all the more grotesque when Elizabeth isn't satisfied with just playing detective and finding every piece of information she can on Gracie. It's that she has to begin, as you're talking about, imitating Gracie's gestures and expressions. She has to go to the pet store where their dirty deed was done and almost relive the moment in some sort of bizarre sexual fantasy. Or
Yeah.
there's the moment where Elizabeth accompanies Gracie and her daughter Mary on a shopping trip to buy dresses. And it's an astonishing moment here for a couple of reasons. One of them being Gracie's brazenly myopic comment about her daughter being brave for showing her arms and not caring about quote unquote unrealistic beauty standards.
What a passive aggressive
Oh my
comment if there
gosh.
ever was one.
Absolutely. As you can imagine, her daughter Mary is devastated.
Yeah.
And Gracie is utterly oblivious. But Elizabeth is sitting there watching it in utter amazement. That's what makes the mirror shot so incredibly engrossing, right? Where you have Gracie on the left side of the frame, Elizabeth in the middle, and because there's a mirror on the wall to their left, the audience's right, Gracie's reflection is on the right side of the frame. So it looks like Elizabeth is sitting between two Gracies. And because of this moment where
Use of mirrors. Yeah.
yeah, and because of this moment she had just witnessed, along with already starting to transform herself into Gracie, she starts to mold into the two Gracies she's sandwiched in between. It's somehow hilarious, but also astonishing. And it only gets more bizarre and twisted from there. I'm not going to get into spoilers, obviously,
Right.
but she has a few moments with Joe later on in the film that are clearly motivated by this transformation that is taking place. And it crystallizes, very much pun intended, with this 3-minute monologue where Elizabeth breaks from her cocoon and becomes the butterfly that completes her alteration.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if Todd Haynes was intentionally commenting on method acting. Maybe he is, but I think looking at it more deeply, it's a captivating look at how misguided art can be by emphasizing process and not the truth. And that's Elizabeth's biggest flaw here. She didn't care about Gracie's truth. Maybe the truth is too gross, which is fair, or maybe it's too emotionally complicated to mimic. I don't know. But whatever the reason, it was mostly about the process for Elizabeth and getting the physicality part of it right. And in the end, not only does she miss the truth, she makes things more devastating for Joe and his family in the process.
I don't necessarily think it's an allegory on method acting specifically, but I do think you're right that it is a commentary on the way artists try to put themselves into their work in an almost naive way, right?
Yeah,
In a way, I was weirdly reminded of Sammy Fableman a little bit, but the big difference is that Sammy Fableman, while he did kind of exploit the horrors and trauma of his parents' divorce for his own storytelling gain, he maintained a sense of truth with it. His job was to find the emotional truth and how it would fuel him. And of course, that's a little bit different because that's an artist that is ultimately a storyteller and less so a performer. But that's sort of the antithesis of Elizabeth here, is that you're right. She's more focused on the A to B to Z of it all, which is why I think the actual ending of the film, which we won't give away, is weirdly hilarious because it almost shows how futile this whole thing was because of just focusing on the process, right?
Yes, exactly.
And I love that.
I love that as well. An ending for the ages. I do love how all of that it just goes on to demonstrate that futility.
And even like the movie kind of addresses that very thing, and it almost foreshadows the ending without you realizing. It kind of gives away the ending maybe a third of the way through, because it acknowledges this made for TV movie that already portrayed this event and how it did it wrongly, that it focused only on the sexuality of it, and that Elizabeth wants to get to the truth, the heart of the matter, what was internal. And when we find out that how futile that it may have been, I just find that ending so ironic then.
I agree. I completely agree. And I think to emphasize that a little bit further, the idea of Elizabeth completely missing the truth of Gracie because she was so focused on emphasizing the process and trying to find some sort of artistic mimicry,
Mhm.
and that is something that clearly meant something to Elizabeth.
Right.
I think the irony of that, though, is how Todd Haynes explores Gracie here, because when you do get to the heart of that truth for Gracie, it's way more fascinating than trying to get her lisp correct
Yeah,
or
exactly.
her her clothing,
Mhm.
or her baking,
That's all
like
superficial.
whatever.
That's
It's
all
all superficial
superficial.
stuff.
Yeah.
Because what's so incredible about Gracie here is that she rationalizes her relationship with Joe in a way that, again, tapping into that word again, in a way that's oblivious to the reality around her. And it's
Mhm.
interesting, arguably unnerving, that she's a little unfazed by Elizabeth unearthing all of these details about her past, at least as it relates to Joe. Now, because of how
Yeah.
things unfold later on in the film, we do see that she is more on a knife's edge than she's leading on.
Letting on, yeah.
Again, the dichotomy of reality versus the facade of appearance that
Right.
we see in Todd Haynes' films. For example, there are a few times where she asks Elizabeth about how things are going for her in finding
Mhm.
the
Mhm.
information she needs. Or there's the moment where she just wants to know what Elizabeth is up to so she doesn't have to lie to her neighbors. And it
Mhm.
makes you wonder if Gracie is being sincere in that, or is she being nosy because she's starting to teeter a little bit.
Yeah.
I do love how Moore almost plays it with this self-assured conviction, because
Mhm.
with Joe, she never wavers. She doesn't
No.
have any guilt or shame, seemingly, anyway. Even when things escalate near the end and she has this pivotal conversation with Joe, she
Oof.
never relents in her assertiveness. It's pretty gross to see how that comes through. And it certainly gives credence to that final exchange she has with Elizabeth, which is electrifying, a little
Oh my god.
hilarious, but absolutely electrifying. And
Yeah.
yet, despite her rationalization, it's really intriguing how her sanity hinges on the kindness of a few neighbors who keep ordering these desserts from her. Again, not going to
Yeah.
get into spoilers, but there comes a moment when that is threatened a little bit, and
Mhm.
she becomes unglued slightly. And
Yeah.
that duality in Gracie is enthralling in this film. And while the film doesn't explicitly get into this, I think you can infer through Julianne Moore's performance, and she's also really great here,
I agree.
that her rationalization over Joe is maybe that's the only way she can live with herself. The
Mhm.
film doesn't spend time on her psychology, and I'm glad that it doesn't.
No.
But you have to wonder that if she's lied to herself so fervently all these years that the lie is just her truth now, and maybe that explains this myopic confidence that she displays when it comes to Joe, and never wavering in terms of her relationship with him, and at least how she feels about him, and not never being
Mhm.
ashamed about it.
Yeah.
That is a fascinating truth here that is obviously gross. There's
Oh,
a
yeah.
complicated nature to it, and yet Elizabeth doesn't care to find that at all.
Well,
And you got to
yeah.
love that polarity here.
That is so interesting about the movie because we often talk about with movies like this that are complicated in nature, JD, that portray taboo things. We never want those movies to necessarily pick a side in what's right or wrong, right?
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
this movie kind of does. Like it ends in a way where it picks a side as far as the right and wrong of this, right? But in doing so, it makes the movie weirdly more complicated, which I've never really seen before. And a lot of that comes down to Gracie, because by the end, is she simply naive or is she just a pure sociopath? It's
It's a little bit of both.
it is like you can argue she's actually one of the most fascinating villains of the entire year. Like,
Yeah.
and I think what's interesting
Yeah.
too is that exchange that she has with Joe that you're talking about, which I don't want to give away because that is, for me, that is the jaw hitting the floor moment of the movie. That was kind of my gasp out loud with what she actually says to him, because it's basically a form of gaslighting, is what it
Yeah.
is.
Yes.
And the idea of that happening in that type of scenario when we're so, I want to try and say this carefully, but we are accustomed to seeing movies and especially true stories kind of have the gender roles swapped when it comes to that form of gaslighting. it creates a new challenging viewpoint on what that can ultimately mean in relationships nowadays. And I love that Todd Haynes is flipping the script in a very social way, a very political way, and challenges those notions even further. Even if that wasn't his intent, I love that that's here in that way.
Absolutely. And I think that's why, again, circling back to the discourse and how polarizing the film can be, I understand it's not going to be for everybody, especially given how heightened Todd Haynes' direction is here, the melodrama of it all, which I love.
I do too.
However, I do think that the film takes a firm stance in relation to Gracie and the manipulation of that character, the gaslighting of it. The film takes a pretty firm stance in that, especially given, and we'll get to him here in a moment, the Joe character and how the film emphasizes the lack of growth he's experienced over 20 years. Not just the grooming of the character, how it's been normalized within this family.
Yeah.
And again, with Gracie seemingly having no shame about it, and this confidence, this overflowing confidence when it comes to her relationship and her actions in terms of having this relationship with Joe, she doesn't seem to have any sort of guilt there. But we do see the effects of that on Joe eventually. So I don't think that the film is offering any ambiguity in that regard, which is why
I'm with you.
I think the discourse, well, actually, maybe I shouldn't speak to it, but I would argue that the film takes a stance, and therefore I don't have a problem with the subject matter here and how Todd Haynes handles it.
I don't think there's a reading here where you can say maybe Todd Haynes is saying this relationship was okay.
Exactly.
That does not exist.
No ambiguity. Yeah, I agree. There's no ambiguity. And then you couple that with Elizabeth for all the reasons we talked about, and how art can amplify the grossness of it.
It can open those wounds again. Like, that's the thing. This movie is not about whether this relationship is right or wrong. It's about what it does to people afterwards, right? Like
exactly.
That's what it is.
And if Todd Haynes did it any differently, imagine the irony of that.
I know.
You have a movie, an artist examining this material, and he falls into the same trap as his Elizabeth character.
Yeah. Like, it's pretty fascinating. Maybe that's a good companion piece.
Maybe. But
maybe Elizabeth will go on to direct a movie based on this story and fails miserably.
Yeah. For Todd Haynes, this isn't just about process. He has an incredible team of craftsmen around him. I do think this is a gripping piece of cinema. But for Todd Haynes, unlike Elizabeth, it all comes back to the truth of it all, which leads us to Joe.
Yep. Broken character. What a tragic character. Because I mentioned earlier, what makes Charles Melton so great here is this is basically an anti-coming of age film. It's about someone that never got the chance to come of age, right? So many times that we're seeing Joe, we find ourselves confused, especially when he's hanging around his children, where he's 36 years old. He's only 12 years older than some of his kids at this point, maybe a little bit more. Even their dynamic feels kind of sibling-like. Like, it blurs that line so much. And you can tell this is someone, Joe specifically, that just never had this chance to grow up. Never had this chance. Like, his life, I don't want to say his life ended at age 12, because that sounds very morbid. In some ways, it kind of did. Like that's where he stopped growing. That's where he reached his threshold, and he didn't surpass anymore. That's why he almost carries himself like a child. He's very innocent, very naive, very unsure of how to even carry himself. He's kind of sulky in some ways. And that's very purposeful. And I think that would have been a very dangerous place for a performance to overdo it, right? Like, he could have overdone it to the point that he comes off like a 6-year-old or something like that. Like, it's so hard to find that right balance, and I think he finds it perfectly.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, this is one of the most devastating and anguished characters we've seen all year.
I agree.
And I love how methodical the film is in building up the emotional power behind him. For a lot of this film, Joe is mostly unaware of how distinct his life has become.
Yeah.
Like any other father, we see him taking his kids to school. He has a job. He has this beautiful home. On the outside, with no context, he is living the American dream.
Yeah.
And perhaps most notably, when Elizabeth starts asking him about his relationship with Gracie, his reaction is that of someone who's clearly never wrestled with what happened to him.
Yeah.
In a movie full of striking dualities, the one that's most poignant is how Gracie's obliviousness is born out of denial, where Joe's is born out of him still being a child, as you're talking about.
Yeah.
He's been so intimately manipulated for so long that he's never been able to grapple with the truth of what happened to him. And as a result, as you've articulated beautifully, he never got to grow up, which is quite evident in the moment with him and Elizabeth. Again, not going to get into spoilers because this does take place near the end of the film.
Yeah.
But in this moment, she simply tells him, this is what grown-ups do.
Yeah.
And that line carries a lot of weight given what is taking place there. He doesn't know how to be an adult.
He does not.
He doesn't.
No.
He's a kid
He knows how to
who
do
likes-
some adult things, but he doesn't know how to be an adult.
Yeah, he's a kid who likes to take care of butterflies.
Yeah.
An idea that permeates into one of the very best scenes of the year when he finds himself on the roof of his house.
Oh, gosh.
And his son Charlie comes out there to meet him. And they have this endearing interaction. But at the end of it, he starts to break down. And he tells his son, I just want you to have a good life. I don't know if we're connecting or if I'm creating a bad memory for you.
Yeah.
That is heartbreaking on its own.
Well,
that gobsmacked me.
It did as well for me. And I think what's so powerful about that scene is, again, going back to the tonal balancing act that Todd Haynes is doing as a filmmaker, because that scene is also weirdly funny as well. As, given the
them smoking weed. He's never smoked weed before.
And clearly this is Joe having an emotional reaction to something that he is not used to. So there is a lot of humor there. So I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. And somehow Todd Haynes made me feel the urge to do both for different reasons at the same time. It's like, it's amazing.
It's an amalgamation of everything that we've been talking about with Joe, in the sense that he is a father to Charlie. So there is a little bit of a weird dynamic where Charlie's like, I'm going to smoke this weed. Is that okay? But it's also, while it is technically father and son, it's almost like two roommates.
It is.
Sitting
it's like
there.
brothers. It's like brothers for a
Two
moment.
brothers having a conversation. Is it okay if I smoke weed here? And Joe, having never smoked weed, which is maybe indicative of I've never had a real adolescence.
Yeah.
I don't even know if I've had a real adulthood, really. And that little detail, I think, is further evidence of that. And so you do sense that, yes, while he very much cares about Charlie, there is this fear in Joe that maybe I haven't connected with my kids in the ways that I should have because of the circumstances of my life. And the emotional bandwidth just hasn't been there for me to do that because I don't know, because I'm a child.
Yeah.
I don't know how to do this. And that comes through so heartbreakingly in that moment, especially given what we learn about Charlie and his twin sister. They are graduating from high school. That is the next scene, is when he shows up at graduation. So he's on the verge of his kids leaving the house, having an empty nest, and he's never grappled with any of this before. This is all brand new that has come out thanks to Elizabeth. And so, it leads to that heartbreaking moment. Although, yes, there are some laughs leading up to it, as you're talking about.
Yeah.
I just want you to have a good life. I don't know if we're connecting or if I'm creating a bad memory for you. It's a devastating moment, but that's not the end of it, Brendan. That's not the end of it, because, and this isn't being talked about enough, and I'm glad that it's not, because
now you can own it.
is such a JD thing. That line is great, But what happens next is that Todd Haynes pulls a midnight special. That's what he does. Because the next moment, right after he says that devastating line, they have a hug. And Charlie says, what does he say? You don't have to worry about me.
Yeah.
To which Joe says, it's all I do. Oh.
Actually, yeah. Sammy Birch
leave.
may have ripped off
leave.
Midnight Special a little bit, but it was the right time to do it.
It's so good. It's so good. And especially because of Melton's performance and how the film builds to it. I think you articulated it very well in the sense that, like, Melton does a great job of, because he could have fallen into the trap of, I got to make this character feel like he's in the 6th grade.
Yeah.
And even though he's 36 years old, that could have, while perhaps been melodramatic and fit
it
the
still
bill
could have worked a
tonally,
little bit.
I don't know if that would have carried the same way emotionally. Instead, he carries himself actually quietly, tenderly. He mopes around, as you were talking about.
Yeah.
You know, he lives his life as an empty shell is what he is mostly throughout this film. So when this moment comes on the roof, yes, it's more of the louder aspect of his performance, but the film builds to it impeccably that of course he's going to unravel there. Of course, when he sees his son and his daughter getting their diplomas on the stage there at the end, he's going to break down.
Yeah.
Just sensational filmmaking and storytelling on Haynes' part. But Melton and the way he taps into that with Joe here, absolutely soul-crushing stuff.
I agree. And I think the casting of Charles Melton is so key here as well. Because in real life, Charles Melton I think he may have been 31 years old at the time of filming this, which doesn't sound much different than 36. But I think we all know that, especially for men, your 30s is when you tend to physically age the most. That's when that's the most notable changes start to happen. And to be honest, I don't think Melton in this movie really looks like a 36-year-old. Like, he kind of does look like a late 20s, early 30s kind of individual. And that adds this weird level of deception with how we're supposed to perceive him as a youthful adult, right? Someone that has, so like the mere casting of someone of that age. And I don't know if this was intentional, but it makes that perception of youthful reality even more clouded, right? And again, of course, Melton as a performer plays into that very well, but just the fact that he doesn't look 36 fully, at least it didn't to me, I think kind of plays with that a little bit. It's so fascinating. Again, don't know if that was intentional, but it's an added layer that weirdly works, maybe by accident.
No, I think you articulate it very well. It's actually a lot of what we talked about in our Priscilla conversation. I know you weren't there for that one.
Right, yeah.
But the casting of Kaylee Spaney in that film works in a very similar way, where she looks so young, like just the casting of her, that when
she
you
looks
see
12.
Elvis, she looks like she's 11 or 12.
Yeah.
So when we see Elvis pursuing her, you're like, okay, this doesn't feel great. And it's a lot of the same thing here, in that Melton, he does very much look the part. He has this young appearance to him. But also, like, he just taps into the character so well emotionally and mentally that he's just this empty shell. He loves to take care of butterflies. Like, that's his biggest thing here.
Yeah, it's adorable.
He takes care of his kids and the relationships with his kids. It is an interesting dynamic that he's just the father of this house. He does all of the fatherly duties. But to your point, you look at him and you're like, that's a child. Why is he taking his kids to school? That's a brother taking his kids to school.
It is. Yeah. That's the older brother coming home from, I don't know, wherever he works across state after just graduating college a few years ago. Like, that's the dynamic there.
But then in the next scene, you see him cuddling with Gracie.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, he is the father.
Yeah.
And it just, it taps into...
You sounded like Maury there for a little bit. Maury Povich. You are the father.
You are the father.
I don't know. I
Yeah,
mean, this story would fit in well with a show like that. I mean, it's got
Mhm.
Jerry Springer vibes all over it.
Yeah, and look, that is great within the context of Joe and the unraveling of the character
Yeah.
and why this film carries a lot of weight. But there's something we mentioned earlier regarding Gracie, like that pivotal exchange they have later on when she starts to gaslight him.
Yeah.
It adds further fuel to that fire.
Oh, man.
And especially given some of the actual dialogue he says to Gracie in that moment, which I don't want to give away here.
Yeah,
but
that is
is
wow.
it's blistering stuff.
Again, where'd this script come from? Sammy
I don't
Birch.
know.
Yeah, yeah.
It's
You're
really great.
you're no casting director. You're a writer.
Yeah, exactly. Did she cast this film too, or did she just
No, I
write
don't
it?
think so. No.
Okay, that would've
Again,
been
most of her
incredible.
work as a casting director were films I've never even heard of.
Oh,
If I'm
okay,
being honest.
gotcha.
So this is definitely a breakthrough role for her in many ways. A major change of pace.
Yeah, and I just want to highlight as we wind down here Todd Haynes' direction and storytelling
Mhm.
because, and I know we briefly mentioned this earlier, the way he embraces and subverts genre conventions in this film, I think is astonishing.
Oh, it's great. The way he plays with tension as well.
Yes.
We mentioned many of the mirror shots, right? The use of mirrors
Yeah.
is almost like a character in this movie.
Mhm.
But there's one in particular that's almost like one of the main posters of the movie. It's the scene in the bathroom where they're doing each other's makeup. And there's a lot of gradual pausing happening between both Gracie and Elizabeth, where Gracie is teaching Elizabeth how she puts on her makeup, so she's doing it
Yeah.
for her. I had no idea if those two characters were going to kiss or punch each other in the face. I had no idea, and clearly Todd Haynes wanted that reaction from me.
Yeah.
The way he plays with tension like that is fascinating.
Yeah, it is interesting the way he toys with with his form in that regard. And as I noted earlier, at least from my perspective, I never found any sense within Gracie that she was concerned with Elizabeth, but
Yeah.
she does throughout the film. Interestingly, when Elizabeth wants to be around her,
Mhm.
Gracie is up for it. She doesn't
Yeah.
push Elizabeth away. She doesn't. It's maybe not
No.
a priority. Maybe she doesn't like that she's all snooping around, but she doesn't actually push back on anything.
Yeah. Which is what makes the moments when she does push back even a little bit all the more stirring, right? Like minor exchanges where Elizabeth will ask Gracie in a very casual, kind of friendly conversation, like, "So what's your relationship with your children?" And Gracie goes, "How's that relevant?" Like a simple rebuttal like that.
Yeah.
It's funny, but it is kind of like the hairs on your neck stand up because you almost feel like, okay, oh, here comes the fight. The punch is about to be thrown. I'm waiting for it.
There is an awkward tension throughout this film that is
Yeah.
extremely palpable.
Oh yeah,
If-
that's if that's not your cup of tea, this movie
Yeah.
might not be for you.
And I admittedly struggle with that. I've talked about that on the show many times
Yeah,
before.
yeah.
Awkward tension for me is sometimes I have to step away. And
Yeah,
there
that's
were
fair.
moments here where I deeply felt it, but I was so compelled by the characters and this dynamic at play that I was able to push through and still be pretty engrossed by it. But I do love how Haynes is playing with his form here.
Yeah.
And of course, as we've been talking about, the writing is so gripping. The film just it uses every trope to its advantage, and it's
Absolutely.
so lush as a result. And also, just to emphasize it again, the music of this film is exuberant. The cinematography is great.
Yeah, it's all great.
It might not be a Carol or a Far From Heaven in terms of its lavishness.
It's hard when you
but
don't have
it's still
Edward
very good.
Lockman. It's really good for what this kind of movie is. It has a haziness that kind of reminded me of a Lifetime movie at times, and I do think that is purposeful.
That is absolutely purposeful because again, this is Todd Haynes heightening up that melodrama.
Yeah,
It is classic Todd Haynes melodrama. But as I noted earlier, maybe even heightened to an even further degree. Like this is the hottest gas he's ever cooked with.
Oh yeah,
For sure.
This movie's weirdly fun. Like it is kind of a fun
yeah.
movie, but it's deep and cruel and tragic. It's like I said, this is a movie. It's a movie, man.
It's a movie, and it embraces its tropes, but also goes out of its way to subvert them. I've seen a couple of critics articulate it this way, so I won't take credit for it. But they've said of this film how it's essentially an original copy overlaid by a critique, giving us two movies in one.
Oh, interesting.
And I think that actually hits the nail on the head.
I like
it's
that.
almost
I
like
like
you're
that.
watching multiple movies at the same time.
Without it feeling like you're watching.
Without
multiple
exactly.
movies.
Yeah. Yeah, in a way that's fantastic. So
Oh, so good. So
I
good.
love it. Do you have
One
any
of the-
final thoughts here?
No, I'll echo again. I think it's one of the better movies of the year. It's if I were to do a very quick preliminary Todd Haynes ranking in my head of all the films I've seen, I think Carol is probably still his masterpiece. But I think if there's one film of his I'll rewatch the most, it might be this one, which probably reveals the kind of person that I am, I guess. But I could see this film topping the list for me in time. I really can.
Yeah. I love Carol as well. That is probably his best still. I'm also a huge champion of Far From Heaven. I love
I like that a lot too. Yeah.
So
I think my
I'd say
number,
between those two and this, that's his top three for me.
Okay. I do need to see I'm Not There, which admittedly is a blind spot for me.
I love that movie.
And I know our friend Ryan McQuaid has that as his favorite Todd Haynes film. So
look, I don't blame him. Like that's a great movie as well. And that's very much in that conversation. Like that's at probably my number 4. But it's like I feel about that the same as his top 3.
Sure.
So I guess if I was going to do it by tiers instead of a ranking, those 4 would be in tier 1. And then maybe like Wonderstruck, Dark Waters, Velvet Underground would be like a tier 2 kind of situation.
Okay, because I know Wonderstruck is probably tier 1 for me, but that's more of a subjective pick because I just like those kinds of movies when adult filmmakers tap into the mind of a child.
It's very good.
So I think if anything, my top 3 would probably include Wonderstruck in some way. I got to think about it further.
And maybe that just speaks to the prowess of him as a filmmaker, because I also love Wonderstruck. If I was to throw that into tier 1, that would be 5 films in tier 1 and a few in tier 2.
And how many films does he have? Like 10?
Not many. Yeah, something
I mean,
to that effect.
I guess. Yeah. Well, I know he also did that miniseries with Kate Winslet, Mildred Pierce. Which, of course, it's a miniseries. It's technically not a movie, but he directed every episode of it. So in many ways, you can almost see it as like a 5-hour Todd Haynes movie.
Sure.
So I guess if you include that 10 or 11, which means at least half his films are tier 1.
Yeah.
S tier, A tier. So it's that means he's doing something right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I love it. So yeah, good stuff. I really love this film as well. One of my favorite movies of the year.
So good.
And I guess I'll just reiterate, Natalie Portman, I don't know. I'm not an awards expert. I don't know if she's going to get nominated for an Oscar, but I would champion her for this. I would take her, and I don't mean this as a slight. I'm not one of those people that loves to devalue a performance to heighten another one. That to me is silly. Right. That's why we have a T-shirt called "The best thing that ever happened to La La Land is that it lost Best Picture to Moonlight."
Yeah,
because I don't love doing
shameless plug. Yeah,
yeah. It's sessionfilm.com/store. Go and get yours today. So I'm not slighting any other performance, but of those that are in contention, I think I could remove, let's say, a Carey Mulligan from Maestro, who's great in that film. We'll get to that here in a little bit, but
okay, yeah.
If Mulligan missed for Portman to get in, I wouldn't lose sleep over it. I guess I'll just articulate it that way.
Gotcha. Okay.
I think she's really great. And then, of course, Melton, it can't be a debate. He has to be in.
Well, he's
Has to
already
be.
won a few of them, right? I know he's won
Yeah.
at Gotham. There are a few other circles or other critics ceremonies that are happening within the same like week as we're recording this, if I'm not mistaken. So he's been the front runner for a lot of them,
Yeah.
which is
Very
good.
good.
Good sign. It's a good sign.
Yep. Absolutely. And then the last thing I'll say, because I know it's also been divisive on social media, I am very much pro the music of this film. I love it.
I think
love
it's
how
good.
it's heightened. Good stuff.
I'm with you. Yeah, you couple that music with a comment about hot dogs, and I am in. I am
so
in.
good. All right.
That was my reaction when that moment happened. That cut that we alluded to in the beginning
my
of this
gosh.
conversation.
Perfect.
My reaction was, okay, I'm in. I'm in.
That's good. I am totally on board. Yeah. No, I'm definitely with you there on that. All right. So those are our thoughts on May, December. If you agree or disagree with anything we had to say here, please hit us up on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. If you're watching us on YouTube, be sure to comment below. Subscribe to the channel, hit the like on the video, all that fun stuff. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please rate and review us there. It really helps out the show a lot as well. And we have a written review of this up at InSessionFilm.com. I think that recently went up.
Yeah.
So you can go and check that out. Am I missing anything?
It's on Netflix. We didn't say that.
Netflix?
Yeah.
I think I mentioned that earlier.
Yeah, I forget if we did or not, but
Yeah.
I did watch this on Netflix. Kind of would have loved to see it in a theater, especially with a crowd, because it's kind of one of those movies I would like to see an experience with people to see how many people are actually with it, So, yeah.
No, I'm with you on that. It would have been a great crowd experience for sure.
Yeah. I could see a couple people being like, "What is this? I'm out.
Yeah.
I'm out." And then other people are like, "This is amazing."
It's so good. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let us know what you think. We are very big fans of May, December. You might not be, but we would love to hear from you, and we'll certainly debate it. So,
all right.
With that said, thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on the In Session Film Podcast. Make sure you get some hot dogs. You need enough.
I love hot dogs. No idea.